You don't want to be identified. Okay. All right. So we are recording. Welcome, everybody. This is the second half of the November 2021 Amnesty Group 37 meeting. My name is Wilbur. I'm the group leader, and we're doing a tribute today to David Weissbrodt, who was one of the co-founders of our group and is a very amazing human rights attorney that has influenced the world. So with that, I will turn it over. We're going to have tributes from a number of people that interacted with David over the years. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ardes Johnson to start us off.
Thank you, Wilbur. I first met David in his living room when he first moved to the house in Kenwood, and he had an organizational meeting for Amnesty International. I went with Sigrid Bachmann, who celebrated her 96th birthday 2 weeks ago, but was a very loyal member of Amnesty for many years. What I remember is that we sat around in David's living room, and he talked to us about the work of Amnesty, and then we wrote letters. And this was at a time when Amnesty, the work of Amnesty, focused mostly on writing letters for people imprisoned. And so we sat on the floor and wrote the letters by hand. In those days, Amnesty gave the information about prisoners, but did not give us the letters. We had to take the information and write the letters ourselves. And so we sat there using the blue air forms, which I'm sure none of the younger people ever remembered the blue air forms that we used. And we wrote letters by hand for the Amnesty. And after that, I think we met a couple of more times in David and Pat's living room and then moved to other locations. But I do remember working for many years for Mutsundico in Zimbabwe, and then we worked for 8 years for Sahai Tolesa in Ethiopia before she was freed. And then Amnesty and the Lutheran Church brought her to Minneapolis for medical care. So anyway, David, back in 1975 or 76, got Group 37 off to a very good start. Thank you.
That's really lovely. Thanks for sharing that. Let's go to, who wants to go next here? Charlie, do you want to go ahead and say something?
Yeah, it's hard to do 45 years of history in a short period, but I will. My mother, Margaret, I believe, started the chapter there with David. David was never known at our home as David Weissbrodt. Never. It was always that saint, David Weissbrodt. My mother could never speak of David without referring to him as that saint. I did a fundraiser for groups that David had started and that my mother had volunteered with, which of course, Center for Victims of Torture, Advocates for Human Rights. I think it was 2004. And my husband and I owned a bar in North Minneapolis, Northeast. And I actually got David to wear a styrofoam halo during the entire event, because so that people could see that he really was a saint. Yeah. The next thing I'll jump to is David asked my husband and me to do a fundraiser probably about 7 years ago for the Human Rights Center, maybe 10. And it was going to be on the 15th of March, and it was for the LGBT community. And I said to David, David, if we're going to increase turnout, we have to have it a toga party because it's the Ides of March. And even though David had agreed to wear the halo at one fundraiser, he just didn't think the law school the dean of the law school nor the president of the University of Minnesota would necessarily agree to a toga party at the Mondale School. And I tried to explain to him, I said, David, if we're going to get gay men and their money out, we need to be in togas. And he drew the line at togas. So we had a togaless fundraiser. The last event that I planned for David was when we brought Fabrice Oudard in from the United Nations 3 years ago, and really wanted to recognize David's work on the standards for business on human rights, because it was something that he worked so hard on. And I remember Fabrice came in from the UN, and he had been at the World Bank before. The point of the story is Fabrice, of course, did his Google research. And when I picked him up at the airport, Fabrice said, "Is this man real?" He said, I've done this Google search on David Weissbrodt. He said, no human could have done what this man has done. And I said, David, I said to Fabrice, that's why we're honoring him. I really want to close on a forward-looking statement. And I was with a group of students with Fionnuala and Amanda at the UN. It's been 2 years ago, as a matter of fact, pre-COVID or during COVID. And the doors that were open to us at the United Nations in Geneva because of David, because of his work, because the University of Minnesota is the leading human rights university in the world. You just don't realize it. And my concern that I know what I have to do now is we cannot let David's work die, is that we all have to, whether it be at the University of Minnesota, whether it's Minnesota's multinational companies, which we have more Fortune 500 companies in Minnesota than any other state per capita, is we have got to all step up to continue David's work, that the corporate sector has got to step forward on human rights. It's what he worked so hard on. And for me to think that all of that work would go in vain when we are on the cusp of changing it, I think this is my call to action now. I know personally is we can never, ever let him just have a legacy. We have got to use what he created to move this state forward. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much, Charlie. That's really amazing. There's a lot of people on the call that are being mentioned, and I want to give everybody a chance to speak that wants to. So let's go to Duluth and hear from.
Thanks, Wilbur. Well, I guess Bret and I will speak as two former students of David. We actually first met David in 1997 when both Bret and I took his international human rights law class at the University of Minnesota. And I was actually at the time working on my graduate studies in sociology. I wasn't a law student, but I had had two people in my life come to me and say, you should take this class, because they knew I was interested in international human rights law. And one of them actually printed out David's biography from the law school website and showed it to me. And of course I showed up. And it was really an incredible class for us. It was for us really the first time that we got to do a deep dive into international human rights law. And we were able to forge a close relationship with David, and he actually ended up choosing the two of us to accompany him as his assistants in 1998 at the UN Subcommission for the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights. And Bret and I didn't know each other at the time.
And obviously we still do now.
Obviously we still do. we worked as his assistants for 4 years in Geneva, Switzerland, and we really cut our teeth as human rights professionals on that work, learned so much about how the United Nations works, how its human rights mechanisms work. And David was an incredible mentor to us in how to do that work, both strategically, ethically, and at a high level, I think, in terms of the quality of what he wanted to do. So it was a real privilege for us to be there as his assistants and to work closely with him. It really helped to, I think, launch us on our professional paths. And I think it was just an invaluable time in our lives. Beyond that, we were also close to David as friends. He would come up here to Duluth to hike with his wife Pat on the Superior hiking trail, and we would go out with him and see him for dinner from time to time. I think we always felt like he, as his former students, he really sort of took us under his wing and took interest in us and helped to mentor us, really, not just as his assistants at the subcommission, but over the course of many years. We would also go periodically once a year down to lecture in his class, which he was still teaching, and we would always do the annual lecture on economic, social, and cultural rights. So that was another opportunity for us to engage with him and also with his class and new generations of human rights advocates coming up.
Yeah, I can't really add much to that other than obviously David is, for me, both of us, I think, probably the one individual that has the most positive impact in my life. I mean, that's how I met Mayra. We were married in 2002. We've been together since we went to Geneva in 1998 with David. He's also the person who introduced us to someone in Geneva who ran an NGO that ended up hiring both of us. And we worked there for 10 years, using a lot of the skills and strategies and tactics that David taught us. And we ended up starting our own organization a little over 10 years ago. So one thing I really want to get out there is that there seems to be generations upon generations now following in David's footsteps. His students like us, and then people that we've been working with have all learned from David. There's exponential growth in the number of human rights advocates out there in the world that have been either directly or indirectly influenced by David. And that's what's nice to have this memorial and to see, or this tribute, and see some of the rest of you, because I really feel like we're all family. We're all part of the David Weissbrodt human rights advocate family. And there's only going to be more and more. Some that may never meet him, but will really have their lives positively impacted by him.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Let's go on to Mike Levy.
I'm going to take a note from what Bronwyn said, which is quite beautiful. She wants to hear stories about her dad. So are you ready to stay here for about a month? I think we weren't planning on that, but we could go around the world. And as Bret says, the generations of people who have been influenced by your dad, it's just endless. And they will have stories that are just endless as well. The thing I'm going to focus on in response to what you say, Bronwyn, is, and then look up in a dictionary, what does it mean to volunteer? And I think it says something like you take the initiative to offer to do something without pay. Now, David totally changed that around, and it's never going to be the same since, and we're going to have to write to Webster and change the definition, because David volunteers you. And if you haven't been volunteered by David, you haven't really lived. It's a wonderful, exhilarating experience, but be prepared to roll up your sleeves, and it's going to take maybe the rest of your life. I mean, it started with David saying, who wants to lick the stamps on these 200 envelopes? That was back in the 70s. We have to send out to our mailing list. Remember that, Ardes? And of course, he looks at me because I look as though I have a big tongue. And so I started licking the stamps, and pretty soon, and this got to be a joke between us, I got something like a sponge. I said, can't we do what they do at the post office, for heaven's sakes, and get a sponge and moisten it? And he said, okay, so we'll call that the cow, and we're just going to use that, and that's going to be our new tool. And that's how it started. The next time, the other aspect of David that is worth remembering is that you can be feisty when you're doing your human rights work, right? I mean, we all know that. David says, let's take on the Haiti campaign. The national section wanted in 1980, take on a campaign about the persecution of journalists who were expelled from Haiti. So he looked around the room, who wants to do that? And he looks at me, Mike, you speak French, why don't you do that? So fine, we do a campaign. They're short-lived, right? Maybe a month or 2 or 3. Oh no, David says, well, Mike, you must know some Haitians in the US. Your brother lives in New York, so I go to New York to visit my brother. First taxi ride I take is from one of these journalists who was expelled from Haiti, driving a taxi. Pretty soon, I'm sending research to London that David says, you've got to get this information that's coming directly from Haiti, get it straight to the researcher in London, get it straight to the team. Then, of course, that's just the beginning. The next thing was he decided we were going to have an Iraq specialist group. Well, Mike, you were in Turkey, you met with the Kurds. Why don't you take this on? But David, I don't speak Arabic. It's ridiculous. I don't know really anything about the geopolitical situation over there. Doesn't matter. You know your Kurds, call them up, get them to give you some information. Pretty soon, I was going off to London to meet with researchers over there. And he said, go volunteer in the IS. Hey, Mike, there's an international council meeting coming up. You don't have enough experience to get on the delegation. Why don't you just go? Just go there, have fun. And I said, well, how can I do that? Well, you just show up and you volunteer. They're always going to need volunteers. Mike, why don't you go to the Commission on Human Rights? You know, you could volunteer with the Human Rights delegation. I can't get you on as a member. But tell them you'll do pour coffee for them or something. Pretty soon, I got to see the inner workings of the US delegation at the Commission on Human Rights, which is, well, I'm glad I didn't have a big lunch because I would be probably sick right now thinking about it. So this just goes on and on. The one thing I can remember that a bit of a caveat is David at one point said, you can take this a little bit too far, Mike, and I'm getting a little worried. He was assigned to observe a trial in Haiti. It was for the torturer Luc Désir. It was a pretty historic moment. The first time there was a human rights trial in Haiti after the expulsion of Duvalier. And he went down there to observe trials, as he went on many human rights missions for Amnesty as a delegate, both for trial observation and as a general mission delegate. Wonderful thing. And pretty soon, I would just take what David says and run with it. And before long, he kind of pulled me in and said, Mike, you know, it's great to do human rights work, but it would be okay if you just don't try and get yourself killed by going up and getting between yourself and the police when they're shooting, between the prisoners and the police when they're shooting at demonstrators in front of a jail in Port-au-Prince. Whatever it is, David would say, take the ball, run with it, question authority. You can do more, we can do more. Get yourself an affiliation. Look at what Bret and Mayra did, and many others within Amnesty who are influenced by David, who formed their own human rights organizations. Be connected with the university or something, get an affiliation. And that's what makes me think that in this time of crisis for human rights, a dangerous, shocking time for human rights, when the European Commission is actually considering regulations, rules that would turn off the right of asylum on and off like a switch, when the rights of all of these conventions that David fought for, lesser known David's work on the Declaration of the Rights for the Rights of Indigenous People, or the Decade of the World's Indigenous Peoples, or the human rights in North Korea when nobody wanted to work on that. the forgotten prisoner, the endless stream of work that David has done, responsibility of transnational corporations. And if he didn't get all the way, he would get far enough that we could then take it further ourselves. And that's what makes me say to Charlie and Bret, we do have the generations who are going to carry on David's work. David will now be reflected in the work of hundreds, if not thousands of people, and we can face these crises. Thanks. Was I muted this whole time?
You were not, we are all,
Good. Because I just thought I was muted, so.
Mike, we are all in awe of David and of your work that you've done with him. Thank you. Let's move on. Let's go to Kristi.
Wow. My heart is full with all of the stories from and flashbacks of the yoga parties and the volunteer capacity building that David would talk. And thank you, Bronwyn, for being here. And so I'll try and keep with the storytelling aspects. So when I returned after working with Article 19 in London in 1987, Kevin Boyle, the then executive director, said, "You need to connect up with David Weissbrodt." And so I picked up the phone and I called him. And at that time, your mom and your dad, Bronwyn, had just one car, and he needed to get to the Minnesota Lawyers International Human Rights Board Committee meeting the next day. And he said, "What are you doing tomorrow? Can you pick me up? Let's go to the board meeting." And so that's what we did. And so the Minnesota Lawyers International Human Rights Committee is now the Advocates for Human Rights. But that was kind of a first step into the, okay, you jump in, and how he role modeled and really took you by the hand and brought you into, whether it was board meetings, whether it was telling you could run a volunteer project in Iraq or some other country that you didn't know. So he also helped me get my initial job with Minnesota Justice Foundation. And when he succeeded on getting a $300,000 grant from the Ford Foundation and a matching grant from the University of Minnesota to start the Human Rights Center there, I came in, and I guess we worked together for 30 years, or 27, I think, officially in that capacity. So David taught me the urgency of becoming a human rights advocate, innovator, educator, activist, and he wasted no time showing me the ropes of the Minnesota human rights movement before we, like so many of you, were walking the halls of the United Nations in Geneva. So back in 1988, he was actually a delegate for Amnesty at that time. And so I was fortunate to go over to Geneva with him as kind of his assistant. And then I too found the love of my life, Mayra and Bret, with my husband, who was a chef over there. And so David was, I guess he took this little 23-year-old under his wing at that time. And then he showed me the power of networking and being a diplomat extraordinaire. He modeled how determination and dedication can change the world through drafting, as people have mentioned, human rights declarations, principles, amicus briefs, to fact-finding, education, and collective action. David was able to breathe life into human rights dreams and careers, always providing guidance on how to navigate turbulent waters ahead. Many have shared kind of his robust building institutions. So we did help to kind of start the Minnesota International Human Rights or Lawyers Committee Advocates, the Center for Victims of Torture. We've mentioned the Human Rights Center. He also had early on started the International Human Rights Internship Program. And Amnesty was, I think, one of his favorite, if I could preference institutions, because he understood the power of volunteerism and engagement, and that you can only continue to be as effective as the community and the human rights constituents who really care about this work, are. So he also kind of was able to build that cross-cultural network through kind of his caring and building relationships. I think with the amnesty angle, I mean, he loved fact finding. So he went to, I was writing down some of the countries from Canada, Congo, Guinea, Guyana, Haiti, Hong Kong, Kenya, Malaysia, Qatar, Rwanda. He loved fact finding for Amnesty and was right there always. And in 1986, he actually was, when he was over in Kenya, he talked to a young lawyer, Gibson Kamakuria, who also presented and came over to Minnesota afterwards. But he said, you've got to be careful. You may, go to prison. And so he meticulously started documenting information about Gibson. And then lo and behold, 2 months later, he was in prison and, worked hard and was able to, I think, develop the initial campaign with Amnesty to lead to his freedom. And he'd do that with even the fellows. We had he helped to launch the Humphrey Law Fulbright program. And Arnold Sunga was a lawyer in Zimbabwe going back to kind of the courts. And we did the same, fact finding documentation in case someone was actually maybe going to be imprisoned. And so he wanted to make sure that they were safe. With his leadership, I know Charlie's funded fellows, but there's been more than 700 student interns who've gone over to work with human rights organizations from Amnesty all over the world, different Amnesty chapters to other human rights organizations. So I think he's already started this movement, I guess, and I think you all are really what it is. So I think we do have to carry on the torch, and I think it's our real import and his legacy that we really have to move things forward. And I think he taught us all how to do it. And so hopefully we can continue to work together, as you were talking about, Mike, to really kind of continue to really, I guess, try and keep the dream alive and challenging the institutions that are continuing working to counter what we know that for the protection of human rights. So thank you very much. Again, I'm so grateful to be here. And Bronwyn, you should know that your dad's true passion was that of being a sommelier. He wanted to actually be he loved food and wine and really wanted to teach others about the importance of that. So I feel like he's a sommelier in the spirit world now, and hopefully watching over all of us to continue the good work. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Kristi. Okay, I think have I missed anybody? Do we have?
Does Fionnuala want to say anything?
I've got something I want to say. I emailed. Is that okay if we go, Wilbur?
Yeah, go ahead, Debbie. That's great.
Okay, I'm Debbie Andresen, and one of the, in the 1990s, I was doing work with some activists on the White Earth Indian Reservation about some clouded land titles. And one of the activists had written like an 11-page paper. He was not a legal person trained in that way, but he wanted to run it by somebody like a law professor to know what they thought. And it was on the quasi-legal status of Native American tribes. And he was frustrated with some of the things that he had read in legal journals. So I called David. Yeah, sure, I'll read it and I'll meet him if he wants to do it. So David read the article, read the paper, and he agreed with them. He had some points to make. And I was always hoping the two would meet, but it didn't happen. But that activist was Marvin Manypenny, and he's the father of our current Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan. So, so maybe Marvin and David are meeting in the spirit world now as I talk about them. And, you know, I was just really, I just appreciated as a person, kind of a paraprofessional lay person in human rights, just having Amnesty International and having the influence of all of you. Just, you know, sometimes current events are so confusing, and to have that human rights angle is really helpful. And one time I went to Washington, D.C. to on an amnesty kind of thing. And I'm on the plane with somebody and he's sleeping. And after he woke up, I told him what I was doing, and he got tears in his eyes, and he was somebody who was testifying about Kosovo, and he was a human rights person. So on the way back, I'm looking for another person that'll be interesting to fly, you know, and I'm noticing that somebody's reading kind of a bunch of technical stuff, and I go by and I see that he's reading human rights stuff. So I kind of break his attention. Hey, you know, I'm this and that. And we start talking, and he says, yeah, I know, well, I'm Minneapolis. Yeah, I know David Weissbrodt. You know? So it's just somebody going back on the airplane. And I just, you know, just how far reaching. That made my plane ride kind of special, just to have a connection. And yeah, David was always just accessible to this group and to people and lay people, and on different angles. And you know, he also, my first experience with him was in '79, and he moderated he was kind of one of the anniversaries of the Declaration of Human Rights and the covenants on human rights. And Gwen Bodley spoke, a congressman spoke, and John Trudell spoke. And shortly thereafter, John Trudell's family was killed in the fire. And he was always cared about John and all of that. So, you know, those were some of the connections. But thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Debbie. We really appreciate that. I'm going to turn it over just quickly.
Wilbur,
because,
Wilbur,
Can I say something?
McDaniels.
Can I say
McDaniels.
something? Just
Yep,
for a
yep.
second.
Yeah.
Back in the, can I do this just for a
Sure,
second?
yep,
Back in the
absolutely.
70s, back in 76, I worked at the University of Minnesota Law School, 76 and 77. And you know, I ran into David Weissbrodt there because he and I went to rival high schools. We were football rivals. He went to Bethesda Chevy Chase and I went to Walter Johnson, 10, 12 years apart. But one day, lo and behold, the Washington Post came into the mailroom, and darned if there wasn't a picture of my boyfriend, that guy over there, he's now my husband, getting arrested at the Pentagon on the front page of the Washington Post. So I said, who gets the Washington Post? And they said, oh, that's Weissbrodt. I said, oh, I took it down to David's office and I said, when you're done reading this, can I have it? That's my boyfriend on the front of the paper. And he read, and yeah, and then he just handed me the paper. I just wanted to say that. About
Can I wonder if I can add a word or two. This is Fionnuala.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I'm in mom mode this afternoon. I'm picking up a teenager from an afternoon game, so apologies that I'm in my car. And for those who don't know me, I'm Fionnuala Ní Aoláin. I was a colleague of David's at the law school, and a dear friend of Pat and David both. And so I just really wanted to say I now have to fill the very big shoes that David held for so long as the faculty director of the Human Rights Center. And just to say that his colleagues at the law school miss him enormously. He was just a giant in so many ways, intellectually a giant, but also just the kindest, most obstinate person on the planet. If he was going to get something done, he would always be the one to get it done quietly. You never knew just how determined he was until he just kept going. And that was true on our faculty in terms of the governance and politics of our faculty, but also just as a thought leader, as an intellectual, as someone who shaped the community of scholars that we were and are. And he's the one, he and Pat are the ones who brought me and my husband Aaron to Minnesota. And my first memory of David and Pat, I knew him by reputation, of course. He was known the world over. But I do remember at a very first evening, we were being entertained We were visiting Minnesota. We had never been in the middle of America before. Oren is Israeli and I'm Irish, and we had a 6-month-old who was teething. And I just remember David and Pat taking turns all evening to hold this baby so that we could talk to our colleagues, which I always think of as their essential way to recruit us, which was to tell us that we would be just fine if we got here and we would be looked after, which we were. I think Amanda Lyons and I, who is also, Amanda's the executive director of the center, and I feel like our job is to honor David's legacy. And one of the things we did last week was to have a teach-in on the day that he passed. We had a teach-in at the law school, teaching the next generation of human rights lawyers who David Weissbrodt was and how everything they experience in this law school is as a result of David. So I hope we'll honor that legacy and that you'll all help us do it, because David's work is simply too important, and the values that he held matter too much to all of us for them not to be felt by every single student who goes through our law school in the years ahead. So thanks you all, and thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for that message. I'd like to do one thing, and that is we got a letter from James Roth. He's not able to attend the meeting, so we're going to have Aaron read that letter for the event right now. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. First of all, there was a remark about how David Weissbrodt was sommelier, and that reminded me of how Amnesty was founded, with a toast to freedom by some Portuguese students in 1961. They were jailed for drinking a toast to freedom, and Peter Benenson heard about this and it spurred him to work for their freedom, and that led to the creation of Amnesty International. Well, to commemorate that, Group 37 has for sale these wine glasses for you name the price. They got the Amnesty logo, I'm not sure if that shows up there, and a little story on them. And so never missing a chance for a shameless plug, but for the inner sommelier and you, we have wine glasses. Just contact me or Wilbur if you want to buy one. And so now I'll read this letter from James Roth about David Weissbrodt. He wasn't able to make the meeting, but he's long been in the orbit of Group 37, and so he wanted to share this with everyone. My initial contact with David was at the University of Minnesota Law School. I first met David when he came to the law school as a young firebrand professor in 1975. At the time here, there was no international human rights curriculum. Based on enthusiastic recommendations from students who had him in their as their torts professor, I took insurance law from him. He would occasionally reschedule classes to travel to Washington, D.C. for international human rights work. He was also the faculty advisor for an international law moot court class, but that was it at the time. He contacted me after I graduated to ask if I would be a trial observer for Amnesty for a political trial in Guyana. He fed my interest in international human rights. My wife and I happened to move into a house across the street from David and his family. The next thing that happened was that he and Mayor Don Fraser met with a handful of young lawyers and proposed forming a group that came to be known as the Minnesota Lawyers International Human Rights Committee. We met in Don Fraser's office and took out our checkbooks and wrote out small checks and formed the committee. I served on the board along with David for 2 decades. One of his first projects was to develop standards for the investigation of politically motivated killings. The standards were developed over a couple of years by Hennepin County Attorney Tom Johnson and others, including pathologists, lawyers, and coroners. They eventually came to be known as the Minnesota Protocol and were adopted by the United Nations. They were revised in 2006 and are still in use around the world. The group was later renamed the Minnesota Advocates for Human Rights. Inspired by a question from his son, Rudy Purpose Jr., about what could be done in Minnesota to address international human rights issues, Governor Rudy Perpich and his family asked David and others if there was another project that could be launched in Minnesota with international reach. He suggested a torture treatment center, the boldest suggestion. At the time, there were 2 in the world, one in Copenhagen and one in Toronto. Doctors from Mayo and the University of Minnesota were enlisted, and then University Vice President Bob Stein enlisted the support of the University of Minnesota, of the university and the Minnesota legislature. A four-room house on campus was rented for $1 a year as the first headquarters of the Center for Victims of Torture with an annual budget of $600,000. I served on the board with David for 2 decades. He insisted from the beginning that the mission should include 4 pillars: healing, training, research, and advocacy. Many of you are familiar with CVT. Its reach has expanded from treating a handful of torture survivors in Minneapolis to a second center in Atlanta and treatment centers in over a dozen conflict areas and a $25 million plus budget. He also established the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota Law School and lured other renowned international human rights scholars and activists and inspired and nurtured students for 4 decades into becoming a human rights activist. One of the things he emphasized was that you don't need to be a full-time human rights lawyer or advocate to be a human rights activist. He set up interdisciplinary programs, including several other departments. He set up the first Internet International Human Rights Library and one of the largest international human rights libraries in the world. The University of Minnesota is now regarded as one of the leading human rights programs in the world. He connected people. He was an incubator of human rights. His legacy is the people and organizations he inspired and people around the world whose lives were saved and improved because of him. And that's from James Roth.
Great. Thank you, Aaron.
Can I just add one quick thing, because you just talked about Tom Johnson? There is a video on the Human Rights Center, I believe Amanda's, a video that Tom Johnson's son did of our trip to Geneva nearly 2 years ago. And I'm not asking you to watch it because I'm in it, but it is the epitome of the generational, that it's Tom Johnson's son that did the video, Aaron, of what you just read from that letter, that David does live on, and that there is this generation. But this video is really the fact that it's because we were from the University of Minnesota, the doors were opened. And David opened those doors that allowed Fionnuala to be where she is, to allow the rest of us. And again, when you see these young faces, I'm the old face in the video, but when you see these young faces in the video, I think it'll warm everybody's hearts that David's work will live on. Thank you.
Let's get another couple speakers. Amanda, do you want to say a few words?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I just put in the chat the video that Charlie's mentioning. And I've just loved hearing these stories. I think in the past week, it's been really special to get to learn even more about David through all the stories that have come in. And at the Human Rights Center, we've just gotten tributes from all over the world, like individual stories that you couldn't possibly know about David. Everybody has these memories, and it's really special. And for me too, David has been so important in my life. I was first his student and worked with him. I was part of the Amnesty student chapter during law school, and that was a ton of work. So if you some of the student groups are a little light, but with David, the Amnesty group was really intense and was a great learning experience for me to get to do that type of activism work and hosting speakers. And yeah, I had just really planned to listen to you all today. I know how special the group is, and I was excited to hear about some stories of David's work. And I just wanted to share two things that I was thinking about. One is, I mean, of course, you all know this, but David just loved Amnesty and he loved the Twin Cities chapter. And so it was always really, really present in conversation and in the Human Rights Center. And so the law school still has Amnesty branded things all over it. Kristi, that might have something to do with you too also, but you go in the law school, like the copy room, the mail room, on the back of every door is Amnesty posters, all like in these hidden spaces of the law school. Kind of these really beautiful, you know, historic posters that had come out of these different moments. And it's really special throughout the law school to see those things. And the other that I was just really thinking about the work that this group does in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, the human rights community at the university put out a pretty simple statement about the killing and systemic racism in human rights terms. That was kind of an immediate reaction of the community. And we got a letter from a former law student who had been the president of the Black Law Students Association. And he reached out to us saying that in 1983, he had worked with David, the Black Law Students Association and David had worked together to document police killings of Black men across the United States and to file these before the UN. And so this student, his name's Arthur McCoy, he has a collection of communications back and forth of submissions with David to the UN and formal responses by the United States. And he had been kind of saving these. And so we had an exchange just about how transformative that was for him to be doing that work. And it was depressing, of course, because at that time, of course, our Black Law Student Association was making the same kind of statements and having to respond. So it's depressing to think about how little had changed from them, but at the same time to think about how visionary that was for David in the early 80s to be engaging international human rights mechanisms and thinking to look inside at the United States about these systemic issues. I mean, he was so far ahead of the field in that thinking and already exposing and engaging law students in that kind of work. And I see, of course, the work of the Amnesty Group, all the work you do in Minnesota politics and UN issues. You're still an example for our students and for all of us, the human rights community, kind of making those links between the international standards. And yeah, it's really beautiful. And it's so great to have all these connections across all the people that David influenced and inspired, and to all be part of one Minnesota human rights community. So thanks for this space, and I've loved getting to hear the stories.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Let's go, let's hear from one more person. Let's hear from Pat.
Hi, this is Pat. I just want to say thank you for putting up this beautiful tribute to David. I'm sorry I missed the very beginning. My technology skills are not very good, so I had a little trouble getting on. But so I missed what Bronwyn said. But I would like to say that Group 37 was always dear to David's heart. You were the firstborn in a way, the one where he learned a lot about working with people and human rights. It was so good to see all you people from the past that I remember, and it's so good to hear you're still carrying on this work. You know, it just keeps going, and that's how it should be. That's what David wanted to be. So thank you so much, and I really loved all your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have anything to add? We have a few minutes if somebody else wants to say something. Angie?
There. Okay, I got it. Someone mentioned something about David's accessibility, and I just want to say that's what struck me about him. I don't have any real long personal relationship with him or anything, but two things. I was an ICM delegate in I think 2007, something like that. And David was on the Amnesty's International Board at that time. And I remember going to that's a huge international meeting with Amnesty people from all over the world. And I remember being in the dining room and kind of, sitting by myself having dinner. And then David came in and he just sat down and we had this discussion. I wasn't any big name there. I wasn't known by anybody there. I was a last minute fill-in delegate. Nobody knew who I was, but he just sat down and we had a great discussion. And then there was another time where I was doing a lot of work on the death penalty and prison issues here in Wisconsin, but the death penalty in general. And I formed an international campaign for a man who was wrongfully convicted on death row in Chicago during the whole 80s period, where a lot of people were wrongfully convicted. And I had the opportunity to go to Ireland and speak about the US death penalty, because for some reason there was a lot of people in Ireland actually coming to the United States and visiting people on death row, particularly people that didn't have anybody else visit them, no other family members. Except, you know, it's kind of expensive. And just out of the blue, because of a connection Mike Levy had, he gave me the funding to go. And I had never met him, and he just thought this was a great thing, you know, for me to go. And I went and I spoke to a group in Dublin, and then I went and I spoke to the Human Rights Center in Galway. And it was just like, you know, yeah, that accessibility, you know, so here's this person that you all paid tribute to walking the halls of the UN and setting up all these international lawyer things that just on the very basic ground level was just an outreach to, you know, the person that they pass, that's a nobody, you know, to do that. And I just thought that that's very important for the family to know. Now, as a board member of Amnesty, I listening to all this, I was just wondering, and, you know, discuss this with the family and discuss this with our current executive director, if Amnesty can set something up to pay tribute to David. So I just am throwing that out there. You know, if we want to set aside like some body of work with his name to honor him, or, you know, some way to try and carry this on, you know, maybe like trailblazing things or anything like that. But I just want to throw that out there to see if the family would be interested in something like that, and if any of these people that have known him better than me could think of anything, and then I can have this discussion with our executive director. Thank you.
I think it's a great idea.
And I'll just mention one thing. I've been in touch with Ellen Moore, who does the archives for Amnesty, because I know that right now the archives for David's papers and things have been put into the University of Minnesota. But I do think, I mean, the Human Rights Center worked and collaborated on a number of things with Amnesty International, from the 4th, you know, newsletters to conferences to publications. So I do think, you know, trying to figure out how there can definitely be at least, you know, that history and really understanding all that his influences in and through Amnesty, I think would be beautiful.
I'd just like to say that the family would be honored of anything you guys would like to do. And it occurs to me, if I were David, he would have an idea immediately. But since I'm not, I leave it up to you, wise followers in his footsteps. And thank you for the thought.
Thank you. Kathya, do you want to say something?
Yeah, very briefly. Thank you, Wilbur. So my name is Kathya, and I met David in 2010 when I came to study as a Fulbright Humphrey Fellow. And it was not secret for us that he loved the Humphrey Fellows. And at that time, Kristi Rudelius-Palmer was the co-director, the executive director of the Human Rights Center. And both of them were the entire time with us. They really took our group under their wings. And we were lucky because David was so strong, and we had him in almost all our classes, and which I don't know if he was able to do in the following years, but with us, we had him all the time. I had the opportunity to have, I can't even count how many times I had meetings alone with him, and I feel that I received from him more than I deserved. And I know that everybody in our group was very grateful for everything he did for us, for the mentoring and for the guidance and the conversations that were so meaningful. All of us were coming from different countries and doing different things. I was a lawyer in Brazil, and I was doing human rights, and but I said to him, you know, I wanted more. I wanted to see more things. I wanted the world. I wanted to help, and he makes this pause, like he used to do, and he says, "Well, it looks to me that you already have it. Just take it." And well, what happens is that I never left because I met the love of my life. And so we married. And so my husband and I hosted many other fellows in the following years. And David and Kristi came here. And so we had the opportunity. And so sometimes I would hear him saying, you know, you did take what was yours, you know, and but it was good because during these years I went to the law school many other times, and actually then I went to go and did my LLM, and I thank Kristi and Amanda because they kept being my mentors in many ways. Every time that I went to the school, either I met him in the halls, or I would go to his office just because I wanted to check on him, and he always had something to say. And sometimes we met downstairs. He says, "Are you too busy?" I would never be busy for him. So I would go with him and I want to show you something, follow me. So I would just follow. He wanted to show me some piece of paper, but he really wanted to connect. He wanted to see how things were going. Is Fred treating you okay? My husband, who is a saint. And one time he sees me in the hall. Come here, are you busy? So follow me. I went with him, and he wanted to give me a book that was written in Portuguese. And he says, "Unfortunately, my Portuguese is not as good as yours, but perhaps you could read. And then let's talk again and let me know what you think." So he had these small things that filled my heart with with care and love, and so much will to mentor. And of course he had the hundreds of other people in the line, so I felt that it was an honor, and it was a blessing for me that I had the opportunity to share so many moments with him, and maybe a little more than the other Humphrey Fellows, because nobody ever was able to get rid of me in this country because he stayed. But I wanted to say, especially to the family, how much he was loved by the Humphrey Fellows. And I don't have a power of attorney to say, but I'm the only one here. And I wanted to know how much we always loved him, and how much he did for this program, and how important, and how much this made a difference in our lives, even if I didn't go back, but everybody else went back. And it has been a blessing for us to have had professor in our lives. So I just wanted to say how grateful I am for have met him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're at time. Does anyone have anything to add? I want to thank everybody for coming today and sharing. It's really amazing. So, Aaron. Oh, I see. You were clapping. I thought you were going to say something. So, all right. With that, I think we can adjourn our meeting. Again, thanks to everyone for all your heartfelt sharings with us and for a special meeting today. Really appreciate it. So
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank
thanks,
you.
everyone.
Yeah.
And our condolences to his family. My heart, we're all feeling for you.
We're thinking.
I'm honored that you came to this.
Well,
So
we wouldn't
very
have
happy.
missed it. Thank you so much,
Thank you, Wilbur.
Thank you.
All right.
Artist.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Aaron.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.